Brendan, if you could turn to Exodus 4. I was thinking the same thing when we sang 111, the rich doctrine our hymn book gives us. Truth is, if you sang out of this or other hymn books each week for 15, 20 years, that's a couple of years of Bible college out of the way, done. There's so much teaching, so much truth, so much substance. Verse 4 said, "Alive in him my living head, and clothed in righteousness divine." There's tremendous teaching in that, friends. And I'm so glad that we get to sing these week in, week out. This is just a wonderful treasure house of God's truth, God's word even put to song. And we are certainly the beneficiaries of that. I am not very good at sermon titles. Once I've prepared a sermon and then preached it, I have no interest in the title whatsoever. Because Jared asked me on Thursday, "Pastor, what's the sermon title?" And then I got to think about something that happened a few days ago. But today's message title is Excuses, Excuses. Isn't that clever? Excuses, Excuses. One of the easier titles I could find and apply to what is going on in Exodus 4, because in this chapter, what we have is Moses giving his excuses on why he shouldn't go and do what God has called him to do. When we were in Exodus 3 last week, God appeared to Moses through a burning bush that would not be consumed, and through revealing his divine name, I am that I am. And we saw that this burning bush said something about the name, this self-existent being that required no fuel. It's not the bush that is providing the fuel, it's God. God, the self-existent one who relies on no one, needs nothing, and yet empowers and gives life to everyone and everything. And God promised Moses in chapter 3 that he would deliver Egypt, God would deliver Egypt, but he would use Moses to do so. We have some ironclad outcomes. God says deliverance is certain, but Pharaoh will be stubborn. Even God acknowledged the stubbornness of Pharaoh. And that his people would one day indeed worship him on the very mountain he appears to Moses. So God is certain of the outcome. And he's going to include Moses in this deliverance. In fact, in chapter 3, verse 12, God tells Moses, "I will certainly be with you." I'll certainly be with you. Well, Moses has two objections in chapter 3. First one is, he says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Who am I?" It's a fair question. You could say he was being humble. Who was he? Why not someone else? And I should say, he says, "But when I come to the people, what do I say to them when they ask me for your name?" Maybe God had given this revelation of his name to his people separately earlier, and they're waiting for the prophet to come and to give them the very same name. They're legitimate questions that God answers. He answers. Well, in chapter 4, the conversation continues between God and Moses. And what we find in chapter 4 is that Moses' fears and concerns are far from alleviated. Moses is not convinced. Moses' heart is not settled on this mission. He doesn't really want it. And he is still going to talk to the Lord about these plans that God has for him. Because verse 1 of chapter 4, Moses asks another question. He says, "But look, suppose they won't believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say the Lord has not appeared to you." Now, God had told Moses back in chapter 3, verse 18, that they would listen to him. God had covered that. It's old territory. God told Moses, the children of Israel, yes, they're stubborn. Yes, they complain. They're but people, but they will listen to you, Moses. But Moses says, suppose. God's certainty had become a possibility. What God said was very certain. Moses says it's only possible. It's very uncertain, very uncertain. Are we not good at turning God's promises into doubts? Are we not good at that? I mean, we can take things that God has said very clearly in his word and we make them like there's a big question mark over them. Did God really mean that? I mean, God tells us many times in the scriptures how much he loves us and how he'll care for us and look after our needs. And yet, what do we fear of a lot of the time? Does God love me? Is he going to look after me and provide my needs? The very points at which God has assured us that he's with us. We're very good at snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Very good at that. Shooting own goals. For those of you that enjoy a good game of soccer. I remember hearing an old evangelist, I tell you he was old because he was old 20 years ago. He was old back then, he was in his 70s then, who said that we need to believe our beliefs, we need to doubt our doubts. That's a good thing to live by, isn't it? We need to believe what's really true and doubt what is untrue. And so Moses did not want to trust God. In 1 John 5 it says, "For whatever is born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith." Our faith. Now, God doesn't initially rebuke Moses just yet, and so what he does, he condescends to Moses' needs, and he gives Moses some signs, or some little miracles, to address Moses' concerns and concerns of those who would hear him when he goes to them. He gives Moses some miracles. Some miracles. Now, let me say something. God had already done the miraculous in chapter 3 when he appears in the burning bush. That's one miracle. He'd already done the miracle. He'd already done that. So God had provided something miraculous for Moses to remember. But God, in his forbearance and his patience, long-suffering, is willing to give Moses some practical encouragements. God isn't rewarding Moses with these signs. It is really more about God's forbearance. Remember when the scribes and Pharisees asked from Jesus a sign in Matthew's Gospel, and the thing is that he'd already given many, many signs. He'd given many of them. And he said, you know what? You know what kind of generation seeks a sign? An evil one and an adulterous one. That's what you are. You're spiritually evil. You're spiritual adulterers, and you want a sign from me. That shows your heart. And he said that, I tell you what, you'll get the sign of Jonah. I'll give you the sign of Jonah down the track. Like Jonah, 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of a great fish. Will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth? You'll get that sign. I'll give you that one later on. And he said, I'll give you another. He said, the men of Nineveh will rise up in judgment and condemn this generation because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. Indeed, a greater than Jonah is here. And then he compares him to Solomon. So often God gives signs to people not because he's pleased with them, but because they won't take him at his word. I'm going to have some more things to say about the signs and miracles of Exodus as we get there. But do not think that the miracles and signs that God does in the Bible are often associated with his blessing. It's often a sign of condemnation for those who will not take his word. So God condescends to Moses. He says to Moses in verse 2, what's that? He says, I've got a rod, Lord. I've got a rod. What do you use for the sheep? What do you use to look after, care for the sheep? Maybe to deal with the straying sheep. He says, I want you to cast it on the ground. Well, Moses does it. And then that rod just instantly, as it hits the ground, becomes a serpent and Moses disappears. Scared stiff. Now, most of us would have done that unless we have some snake lovers amongst us today. Some snake lovers. You probably need help if you love snakes, holding snakes. I can't stand Can't stand snakes. Can't stand them. It's one good thing about not living in North Queensland is you don't tend to have the same snake problems that... I mean, there are people that are employed snake handlers in North Queensland. They travel around getting snakes out of bathrooms and bedrooms and all sorts of places. We had friends who lived just on the corner of a cane field, and the cat disappeared. The cat disappeared at one point, and they found the cat. The cat got its revenge because the snake choked on the cat. It choked to death trying to consume the thing. I'm not turning you off dinner tonight. Forgive me for saying that. But snakes are fearful things. Cobras. The cobra was the guide of the Lower Egypt. It was the symbol of Pharaoh. You've seen the serpent images on Egyptian architecture. And it really pointed to the satanic element of Egyptian worship. The serpent, the first serpent in the Bible. But essentially, God takes this ordinary shepherd's staff and makes it deadly. Now, we know that Pharaoh's magicians could do the same thing. They had a level of spiritual power too, given to them by Satan. But this would catch people's attention. This rod, later in chapter 4, it would be called the rod of God. Chapter 4, verse 20. Francis Schaeffer had a sermon called No Little People, No Little Places, and he said, consider the mighty ways in which God used a dead stick of wood. God so used a stick of wood can be a banner cry for each of us. If God would use a stick, if God would use an inanimate stick, he will use his people. The preacher said, we're not less than a stick of wood, not less than a stick of wood. He said, but as the rod of Moses had to become the rod of God, so that which is in me must become the me of God, then I can become useful in his hands. God can use the little insignificant things to do incredible things. Are we not more than a stick of wood? This very humble little sign. Well, God is going to do even more than that. He says in verse 6, put your hand inside your bosom. I guess it's a little bit like this when you reach into your garment. So I want you to do that. And so Moses did that, and his hand comes out, and it's a leper's hand this time. It's a leper's hand. Maybe scaly and swollen. You've seen pictures, maybe movies of lepers featuring. It's a nasty, horrible disease. It featured commonly in Egypt. It was a very common disease. And unfortunately, we know all too well things like quarantine and isolation. That's what Leviticus had for those who actually had the disease. And they had to be isolated. And if you could survive the disease and get the right treatment, you would present yourself to the priest, and there'd be a cleansing and a confirmation that you were ceremonially clean. Then Moses would put his hand back into his bosom, and just as though nothing had happened, an instant, incontrovertible miracle. No doubt about that. Not just he had a bad back and he's feeling better for the next few minutes, or adrenaline kicked in and he's fine, right as rain. You can't manipulate these kinds of miracles. And God says in verse 8, if they're not going to believe the first one of the serpent, then they might believe the message of the latter sign. The latter sign. God knew the unbelief of his own people. He knew they needed some encouragements along the way. But there would be a third sign, and this would be water becoming blood. It would be, in fact, the first plague. Water becoming blood. He said, you'll take water from the river and pour it on the dry land. And friends, we're not talking about, don't think about red cordial. Don't think about red cordial. Think about blood being poured. Thick red blood. This would have been a very troubling miracle. This means judgment is coming. Judgment is on its way. So, don't you think God's done enough by now? You've got a burning bush, you've got his name, you've got three signs happening. You've got a rod becoming a snake, you have a hand that could become leprous and healed instantly, you have water becoming blood. Moses' concerns must all be taken care of. The prophet must now be in his right frame of mind. And then look at what Moses throws at God now. What Moses throws at God. He says, "Oh Lord, I'm not eloquent. I'm not eloquent." Or literally, I'm not a man of words. Not a man of words. He says, "Neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Has this idea that there was this heaviness around him. He struggled to communicate. Was it a stutter? Was it some kind of impediment? Was it a fear of people? We don't really know. That's really not the point. Now, God was going to give these signs to Moses, though he had a stutter, whatever it was. God was going to give him incontrovertible proof that he was God's spokesman. So Moses focuses on his weaknesses. And I suppose it would be an issue if God's going to call him and send him to speak in front of Pharaoh. You do want to present well. You do want to present well. I remember being in a church service one Sunday night many years ago in a church, and I'm not sure if the pastor was trying to help a guy with his public speaking and other things, but he was up giving the announcements, and I couldn't hear him. I couldn't follow him. It's like, if you're going to do announcements, be heard. Be heard. Did the guy want to be up the front? I don't know. I would have loved to have known what they were trying to accomplish there that evening. But I can see how Moses wants to present well, and for all he's standing in God's stead. Now, Jeremiah had the same issue in Jeremiah 1:6. He says, "Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a youth." Jeremiah had evidently had the same problem. He wasn't ready. He didn't feel like he could do it. And so Moses gives this to the Lord. He gives this to the Lord. But remember, God had promised Moses the victory, and he knew Moses' limitations. I mean, here's the thing. How can the children of Israel believe if Moses doesn't? How can the people be convinced if the prophet isn't convinced? If Moses is full of doubts, how are the people going to go? He's about to become a blind leader of the blind. Now, Hebrews 11 tells us previously Moses had faith as a 40-year-old to step out of Egypt and to identify himself with God's people. Moses has a track record of faith. He's not a coward. But our faith needs to be nurtured every day. Yesterday's victory doesn't mean today's victory. Faith isn't static. It ebbs and flows. It ebbs and flows. And so Moses is suggesting to the Lord that, Lord, though you have called me to this task, you have not equipped me. You haven't given me the wherewithal. In fact, if you look at verse 10 again, look at verse 10, he says, "I'm not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant." He said, "God, before you said anything to me, I had this problem with my speech, and even after you tapped me on the shoulder, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed." If you wanted a spokesman, at least I could speak properly. That's what Moses is getting at here. "Lord, you made me with defects that disqualify me." That disqualify me. Can't do this. Can't do this. Moses accuses God of calling him but not equipping him. You ever done that? You ever done that? Ever done that? Where you had an inkling that God has something for you to do for him, but fear took hold. Fear took hold. You didn't even try. You didn't even try. So you never knew what would have happened. And you don't even try. Don't try. And look at what God says in verse 10. God doesn't hide from Moses. He doesn't hide from Moses' accusation. He said, "Who has made man's mouth?" Now we're thinking, you might think, oh, that's the perfect creation. Makes Adam and Eve, I mean, they're just perfect. There's no impediments, no disabilities, no genetic issues that come up, that you've got problems. But then God says, and this makes it really hard, he says, "Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord?" So see that what the people that have disabilities, for want of a better term, that you see around. God made them just as much as someone that doesn't have the same disability. You need to understand that. Not even the fall stopped the creative acts of God. And this is a blessing, particularly when you have a disability. You have children with disabilities, parents with disabilities, that God wasn't singling you out for displeasure. God didn't give you something second rate. Understand that. God made that person. He makes us with our abilities and our disabilities. He does both. And how sad that, not that long ago, people with disability did live in shame, a sense of shame. Parents had the sense of shame. Society gave them that to some extent. Why? Because they'd forgotten Exodus 4. It's in the Bible. God made them all. And so God doesn't go into hiding. Yeah, it was me, sorry. No, I did make you with the impediments of speech, with the weaknesses, whatever it is. And you know what God says in verse 12? He says, "Now therefore go." Go. I've heard you. Yes, I made you. And you still have to go. God doesn't give him an exit ramp. There's no exit ramp in Exodus 12. In fact, God says in verse 12, "I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say." God promises Moses professional development, on-the-job training. God is going to be his coach, his mentor, to adopt the modern terminology of things. He's going to be his partner. He's going to be there right next to him. He's going to help him. Divine tuition and power, right? Moses doesn't get off the hook. Moses doesn't have any concept of improvement. He just says, "I just haven't got what I need, so I got nothing." God says, "I'll be with you and I'll teach you. We can work through this. We can work with this, Moses. You can get better. God gives us abilities that we need to develop. This is what Paul says in Romans 12. Romans 12 says, "Having then gifts differing to the grace given us, let us use them," Paul says. He says, if prophecy, that's preaching, let us preach in proportion to our faith. If it's ministry, let us use it in our ministering. He who teaches in teaching. He who exhorts in exhortation. He who gives with liberality or with generosity. He who leads with diligence. He who shows mercy with cheerfulness. You think you have a gift of hospitality, start cooking. The first few cakes, okay, after you've perfected it, I'll take the cake. No, right? Use your gifts. If your first attempt is a C, then go for a B next time, right? We've got to be willing to use our gifts and to develop them. Moses wants this perfect ability to communicate, and God says, "I'll be with you, I'll help you, be patient. Now, is that enough for Moses? He's got the signs, the name. He has the promise of God's presence and help. Is that enough? Well, Moses, now in verse 13, he lifts the lid on his own rebellious heart. Because he says in verse 13, "O my Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send." The implication is, Lord, send anyone you want except me. except me. Moses didn't want to go, if the truth be known. Regardless of a burning bush and a wonderful name and miraculous signs, God's help, God's presence, he didn't want to. This happens all the time, friends. This happens all the time. When God's people don't attempt things for him, despite all the help, all the promises, all the resources, the problem is, I'm uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable. I'm out of my comfort zone. Well, look at verse 14. Finally, we have the anger of the Lord. If you're really thinking, God, you're so patient. You're so patient. Why aren't you angry a little bit earlier? Finally, God gets upset with Moses. And God says, is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well. Look, he is also coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You know what God does for Moses? He gives him not an exit ramp, but he gives him some assistance. He gives him some human help. It's a divine concession. You can take Aaron. You know what Aaron was? A mixed blessing. You know what I'm saying? He was a mixed blessing because Aaron could speak well, but Aaron made a golden calf. And Aaron speaks against Moses in Numbers 12. Good help is hard to find, friends. It's hard to find good help. And so Aaron is a blessing, but Aaron wasn't on God's radar. Moses was. God knows Aaron is a much better speaker, but God hadn't chosen Aaron. He chose Moses. However, God does let Aaron join with Moses and minister. Aaron is God's concession to Moses. Moses would miss out on God's blessing. He would still be there with Moses. But here's the point. Here's what I want you to remember. Every time Moses walks in with Aaron to Pharaoh's court, if Moses is thinking the right things, Aaron's presence reminded him of his own unbelief. Remember that. Remember that. God had given Moses blessing after blessing. He could have walked straight up to Pharaoh on his own with God's help, with God. But Aaron will be there. Aaron will be there. This was a divine concession. Moses was not getting out of this. He was not getting out of this one. And then in 15 through to 17, we have this relationship between God, Moses, Aaron, because God tells Moses, look, you're going to speak to him, put the words in his mouth, but I'm going to tell you what he'll know. He says, I'll be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I'll teach you what you shall do. So God speaks to Moses, and then Moses communicates the message to Aaron. Aaron doesn't go directly to God. He goes through Moses. He's a mediator. Aaron will never be in any doubt that he comes second. Aaron will never have these direct meetings with the Lord to be given the communication and the revelation. Moses cannot get out of that. You don't need to be a good speaker to hear God. Got nothing to do with your speech. And so Moses will be the mediator between Aaron and God. There are numerous mediators in the Old Testament. And of course, we know that Paul tells Timothy that we have a mediator between God and man, Jesus Christ. The man, Jesus Christ. He's our mediator. In fact, in verse 16 of Exodus 4, it says, So Aaron shall be your spokesman to the people, and he himself shall be as a mouth for you. Aaron is going to be your mouth, and you shall be to him as God. You're going to be like God to him because you have my words. You have my words. You shall take this rod in your hand with which you shall do the signs. You know, when people teach God's word, the reason why I like people to bring a Bible with them, and I have an open Bible, you have an open Bible, is so that you can evaluate whether what you're hearing is from God or not. Now, I agree every preacher has an interpretation. We can't help but have an interpretation. But at least you get to look on as well. and see, is this what God is saying? Is this a fair representation? Is this a fair point, honest point that is being made? And so Moses would have his help, but it would be a reminder to him of the day, the time, where God's promises and God's signs and God's presence weren't quite enough for him. Weren't quite enough. I trust they'll be enough for us today. We need to trust what God says and not have all crutches, spiritual crutches around us to soften the blow of living by faith. We need to believe what God says and trust him. Now, in a few moments, we are going to celebrate the Lord's Supper. And in a few moments, I'll ask Pastor Glenn if he would, and maybe Brother Paul to come help me. And I was thinking how Moses, the end of Exodus 4, says to the Lord in effect, can you send anyone else? Can it just be anyone else? Anyone else? Well, God has Moses for this task, and then he gives him Aaron. I thought about when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane and he contemplates the cross and what it would mean for him. And he says to the Lord, Lord, let this cup pass, but nevertheless at your will. Nevertheless. I think we realise that there was no other. There was no Aaron. There's no one else. It's Jesus or there's no one. There's no one. He's the only Saviour given to us. And when Jesus said, let this cup pass me, he wasn't refusing the cross. He wasn't refusing the cross. Understand that. Understand that. But we have the Lord as the Son of Man, this enormity of what is to take place, the sins of the world on his shoulders. The one who had never known sin. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done, Christ says. He's greater than Moses. The writer of the Hebrews tells us he is greater than Moses. Moses was a mediator between God and Aaron. Now Jesus, he's the mediator between God and his redeemed children. Everything we do in church is through the mediatorial work of Jesus. Our singing, our prayers, the message. It all gets to the throne of God because of our relationship with the Son. And our worship is accepted through the Son. And as we remember Christ today, remember that he's our only mediator. He is the worthy mediator. There was none other good enough, the hymn writer said. There was no other alternative. Christ and only him